I feel like God's already done stuff already, hasn't it? And that excites me. Traditionally, we celebrate Palm Sunday, which is why we've got palms today. But I'm not going to talk about Palm Sunday at all, because my husband gave me the theme of the final Passover. So I said to him, so are we having communion today, Andy? And he went, no. So let me get this right. It's Palm Sunday. We're having palm crosses, no communion, and I'm speaking on the Last Supper. Yeah. So, but having said that and gone away and just spent time with God and seen God speak to me, I actually think it's really right that we are doing it today. So you've heard it here first. My husband was right. So, fast forward from Palm Sunday, 3 days. Jesus in Jerusalem, been really busy. He spent 3 days busy answering the questions and being caught out by the teachers of the law and the Pharisees and all those religious people. He's turned over a few tables in the temple, righteous anger. And now we're landing on the Thursday of that last week. And I'm going to invite my very good friend Catherine now to come and read from the scriptures, because Ed inspired me that it's good to read from the Bible when we're preaching. I think he said that last time.
Do 3 things at once. Yeah, that's fine. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, also called Passover, drew near. This is Luke 22, verses 1 to 37. The high priests and religion scholars were looking for a way to do away with Jesus, but, fearful of the people, they were also looking for a way to cover their tracks. That's when Satan entered Judas, the one called Iscariot. He was one of the 12. Leaving the others, he conferred with the high priests and the temple guards about how he might betray Jesus to them. They couldn't believe their good luck and agreed to pay him well. He gave them his word and started looking for a way to betray Jesus, but out of sight of the crowd. The day of unleavened bread came, the day the Passover lamb was butchered. Jesus sent Peter and John off, saying, "Go, prepare the Passover for us, so we can eat it together." They said, "Where do you want us to do this?" He said, "Keep your eyes open as you enter the city. A man carrying a water jug will meet you. Follow him home. Then speak with the owner of the house and say, 'The teacher wants to know, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?' He will show you a spacious second-story room, swept and ready. Prepare the meal there." They left, found everything just as he told them, and prepared the Passover meal. When it was time, he sat down, all the apostles with him, and said, "You've no idea how much I have looked forward to eating this Passover meal with you before I enter my time of suffering. It's the last one I'll eat until we all eat it together in the kingdom of God." Taking the cup, he blessed it, then said, "Take this and pass it among you. As for me, I'll not drink wine again until the kingdom of God arrives." Taking bread, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Eat it in my memory." He did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant written in my blood, blood poured out for you. Do you realize that the hand of the one who is betraying me is at this moment on this table? It's true that the Son of Man is going down a path already marked out. No surprises there. But for the one who turns him in, turns traitor to the Son of Man, this is doomsday." They immediately became suspicious of each other and began quizzing each other, wondering who might be about to do this. Within minutes, they were bickering over who of them would end up the greatest. But Jesus intervened. Kings like to throw their weight around, and people in authority like to give themselves fancy titles. It's not going to be that way with you. Let the senior among you become like the junior. Let the leader act the part of the servant. Who would you rather be, the one who eats the dinner or the one who serves the dinner? You'd rather eat and be served, right? But I've taken my place among you as the one who serves, and you stuck with me through thick and thin. Now I confer on you the royal authority my Father conferred on me, so that you can eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and be strengthened as you take up responsibilities among the congregations of God's people. Simon, stay on your toes. Satan has tried his best to separate you, all of you, from me, like chaff from wheat. Simon, I've prayed for you in particular, that you not give in or give out. When you have come through the time of testing, turn to your companions and give them a fresh start. Peter said, Master, I'm ready for anything with you. I'd go to jail for you. I'd die for you. Jesus said, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, Peter, but before the rooster crows, you will have 3 times denied that you know me. Then Jesus said, when I sent you out and told you to travel light, to take only the bare necessities, did you get along all right? Certainly, they said. We got along just fine. He said, this is different. Get ready for trouble. Look to what you'll need. There are difficult times ahead. Pawn your coat and get a sword. What was written in Scripture, he was lumped in with the criminals, gets its final meaning in me. Everything written about me is now coming to a conclusion.
Thanks, Kath. I particularly asked Catherine because Catherine's one of my oldest friends and we've known each other, I think, 34 years, something like that. And you'll see why I asked her to read it in a minute. So, when I grew up, a ritual of Holy Communion was a big deal. Andy and I used to go to an Anglo-Catholic church and having communion was really important. But it's come to mean something slightly different as we've got older, in a different way. And I just want to set the scene around this Last Supper. So this is the 3rd year that Jesus has been with his disciples, and he's probably gone up to Jerusalem each time, because in his day you could only have the sacrificial lamb done at the temple. But just to go back a step, why did they celebrate this Passover? They celebrate the miraculous escape from Egypt of the 12 tribes. And this shared experience formed their national identity. And at the heart of this Passover, there was a covenantal meal. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they ate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which took a week. And the Passover was usually day 1 or 2. And on those days, they were meant to kill an unblemished lamb and wipe the blood on the doorposts. They were meant to eat bitter herbs. And it was all to celebrate the Passover, the last plague of Egypt. And it's based on Exodus 12. But something about this experience that they'd had formed their identity. One of my lasting memories, a number of years ago now, must be 20 years ago, is I had a group of 7 or 8-year-olds. I was a teacher. And we were doing Passover together. So I thought it'd be really nice if we did a Passover meal. So I had a lovely table on the floor with cushions around it. And we had all sorts of different things to eat. And then one by one, these children got up and ran to the bin and started spitting out what they ate. And what they'd done was actually eat some of those bitter herbs, dipped in salt water, which tastes pretty horrible, which represents the tears and the bitterness and the harshness of the slavery of the children in Israel in Egypt. That was fun. Can you imagine the cleanup afterwards? But it's also a time of celebration. So we had Jewish music and we had dancing, and it was great fun. Now, Middle Eastern meals were quite special. And when there was a special time, they would put cushions and a low table down to the floor. And behind me, you can see the upper room as it looks like today. So this is when we went to Israel in September. You can see all the arches. They are not modern. They're fairly ancient. But this is where the upper room was. And it was usually somewhere in the southwest, quite wealthy area of Jerusalem. And the idea was that this meal would be celebrated every single year in covenant. What does that mean? It means the lasting agreement that God had made with his people in Egypt. That was his covenant to the people of Israel. But in turn, every Passover, they have this low table with cushions on the floor. Do you want to turn that on for me, Beth? That's great. I don't know if you can see that very well. Basically, you would lean on your left arm almost into the chest of the person next to you, and you would eat with your right hand. So it was quite an interesting feat of, moving the body around, really. And in Jesus' day, the only place you could really get that lamb sacrifice properly, as I said, was Jerusalem. So Jesus is busy starting to make preparation. I love how he tells Peter and John, go and find a man carrying a water jar. They just don't do that in Israel. It was the women that carried the water jar. So looking for a man was very specific and quite odd. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Sometimes I ponder how often God asks you to do something odd. It seems often God asks me to do something odd. And even this week, I was prompted to share a word with somebody that was very specific about a sharpened arrow. And I was describing this arrow to this person thinking, I'm not quite sure what this is about, Lord, but I'll do it. And 2 days later, she very excitedly texted me and said, I now understand what that arrow's about because I've just opened my Kindle and the next book I've got to read is called The Sharpened Arrow. So I was rather excited when God does give me odd things so that he has a response. I've also got a reputation for making men cry. In Andy's leadership circles, it's great. But do you know what? I really believe that's God in me working. So here we are. Peter and John go and find this room, this guest room. They sweep it to get rid of all the yeast, or leaven as it's known. And they arrange this 3-sided U-shaped table. And then they have to go and have a mikveh. And if you've been around the last few months, a mikveh is a ritual bath. They had to do that before they could buy the unblemished lamb and take it to the temple to be killed. So his throat gets cut and the blood gets poured on the altar, and then they return to the room and cook it. So this is them reclining at the table. Sorry, that's me. Let's go back one. At the top there, you can see 2 figures, and there's a gap in the table, and that's Jesus. All right, in the middle. And one side of him is John, and the other side of him was Judas. Now, whenever they had these meals, the host would sit at the head of the table. So in this case, it's Jesus. Sorry if you can't see it very well. Is it worth turning a light off, Hayes? I don't know. Can you just knock the light off for a minute, wherever it is, Anna? Oh, we can put it back on after, straight away. So can you see that better now? We'll put the lights on because of the camera in a minute. But at the top, you've got Jesus in white. The other side of him is John. And then you've got Judas, who's just got up from that space. And to the left of the host was the most important place at the table. That's fine, Hayes, thanks. And to the right is the next important place. And if you remember the Bible, James and John were arguing about who was going to sit at his left and right. Do you remember that? Well, this is what it was about. And if you sat this way, and you particularly had those honoured spaces, it meant that you had cool friendship with the person you were sitting with. They were most important to you. And then Jesus would dip his bread in a common dish and give it to the person next to them. And when they dipped it in the dish, he gave it to Judas, didn't he? And in that moment, Jesus was having the opportunity to give Judas another chance, because the proper Middle Eastern response is to take another piece of bread, dip it in, and give it back to the person who's giving it to you. But he didn't, did he? Unfortunately, he responded by getting up and leaving the table. Now, how many of you, be honest, have ever been to a wedding breakfast or a wedding meal, and you've looked at the place setting that you're at, and you felt you should change your mind and move seat. Anybody ever done that? Yeah, I'm sure you have. Thanks, Andy, at the back. Because you don't really want to sit next to the person you're next to. Is that right? You want to go and sit next to somebody who's more important to you? Yeah, we've all done it, honestly. And Jesus often said to the Pharisees, didn't he? You love your seat. You love the place of honor at your feast. It was an open criticism, really, because he was exposing us as those that crave attention and look down on the people. And sometimes it's really easy to want to people please, compare ourselves. There's all those elements in there. I don't need to go on. But Jesus does the unthinkable. Normally, you would go into this room, you'd wash your feet, and then you'd go and sit down. But Jesus gets up and he washes every single person's feet. Ugh. Can you imagine the water afterwards? In John 13, he says, do you not understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. But I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet. You also should wash one another's. And basically, Jesus was defining what it means to be a true leader and servant of all. Greatness isn't defined by our position or our seat or our title. It's actually defined by our faithfulness and service to God. We can then imagine, can't we, at this feast, that Jesus starts to recount the story of the deliverance from Egypt. And if you're a Jew, there's lots of elements to this story. We aren't always sure in the first century what that looked like, but we do know they had 4 cups. And the first cup would probably look something like this, but not decorated, but it'd be about that size. And that was known as the Kiddush cup. Or, otherwise, it was called the cup of sanctification. And it links back to that story in Egypt where God says, I will bring you out. And drinking from this cup is an act of sanctification, an act of remembering, an act of knowing that God has brought you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. Then they used to break bread, just like Jesus did, and we'll come back to that in a second. And then they would drink the cup of deliverance. Back to Exodus again, I will rescue you from bondage. Then they eat the lamb that they've slain, and then they have another cup, the cup of redemption. And then they have the cup of praise. All those elements in that story. So, let's think about Jesus. Jesus comes and he reinterprets this meal for us. And the first thing he does when he sits down, he says, you've got no idea how much I wanted to celebrate this meal with you. Knowing it's his last meal. There's almost an expectation, perhaps, in Jesus that this meal will change the disciples' minds about how they might behave. Because he knew he was going to enter his time of suffering. Now, a covenant was always sealed with the shedding of blood. Always. So these special covenantal meals were so important. And if you want to read more about that, you can read it in Hebrews 10. Perhaps spend some time in it this week. But this Passover meal launched the feast of unleavened bread, and it ran all week. And the first thing Jesus did was take a cup, the Kiddush cup of sanctification. So what was he saying? Drink this, because I won't drink it again with you till I drink it in the kingdom. And this isn't the one where he says, this is my blood. This is another cup at the beginning, about this size, and he would have passed it round. Then he breaks the bread, and we all know what he says then. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now, the disciples would have gone, hang on a minute, that's not the traditional meal. Well, what's Jesus doing? What's that about? And then he takes the cup of deliverance, the next cup of wine. And there he's saying, I am going to rescue you from bondage. Just like the Egyptians had to let go of the people of Israel, Jesus is saying, I am going to rescue you from sin, from separation. I'm going to set you free. You will no longer be a slave to anything. And we read, don't we, Jesus at his baptism was called by John, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That was a looking forward to this next Passover, this new covenant. Then he took this cup and said, this is the cup of redemption. I'm going to redeem you with my outstretched arm. And we read this, don't we, in Galatians, when the fullness of time come, God sent his son, born of a woman, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons and daughters. He's telling them that I'm going to shed my blood for you and for every follower afterwards. And he was laying a new foundation, a foundation for a new sacrifice. A new era was being ushered in. And it started with Jesus' death, this new covenant that he was establishing. And then they finished the meal and they have the cup of praise. And I think one of the Gospels says they went out singing. And then I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but when you take communion, when we take this meal, it's so easy, isn't it, for it to become a regular thing and we don't remember what it's all about. So I'm glad we're not doing it today because I've got a challenge for you. I want you this week, somewhere, might be Good Friday at the Hub, it might be Good Friday at HLC, it might be somewhere else. I want you to take that cup as an act, a renewal, an agreement between God and you and those with you, that you might fully identify with Jesus in a new way. It might be an act of cleansing, it might be remembering, it might be restoration, it might be a letting go of something. It might be a release of burdens, sins. It might be something signifying freedom that you're enslaved to. Maybe it's that video game that God is challenging you about. Or maybe it's not a video game, maybe it's a program on the TV, or I don't know, you might be addicted to shopping. Whatever it might be. This is a moment, this Good Friday, for a new covenant. To take it with Jesus. We've got not a lot in our culture in the UK of anyone identifying fully with the Master. But these disciples had dedicated themselves to living, eating, sleeping, working, playing, suffering, and breathing every moment of their lives with Jesus. Every single moment. So that his deepest purpose became theirs and ultimately ours. That's what we have then to give away to others. That's why I want you to think about this serious business of this meal. When we were in Israel recently, we had a Passover meal. And we had it on the shores of Lake Galilee. And they took some pottery with a hammer. And they broke it as a symbol of his body being broken for me. And as soon as that hammer hit this, I was so overwhelmed by that covenant identity I could have with Jesus, because he'd done it all for me. And we all took a piece of that pottery away to remember that sacrifice. What else does this story teach us? It teaches us a lot about Judas' betrayal, doesn't it? I said to Andy the other day, do you think right at the beginning when Jesus called Judas that he knew he was going to betray him? Do you think he knew that? I don't know. But John 13 says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. So you can imagine leaning back. And he then declares, the one who shares this bread will betray me. And Peter, who's at the other end of the table, which you can't see very well, on one of the sides, was going, nudging John, going, ask him who it is, ask him who it is. Can you imagine all the disciples doing that around that table? Who is it? Who is it? Who's going to let him down? Who's going to fail him? Who's going to really screw everything up? I don't know if we really know what the word betrayal means sometimes today. I was doing a Last Supper thing with some kids. Again, not when I was a teacher, when I was an advisor in a local school. And I went through the whole of the Last Supper with them. And then we got to talking about what it meant for Judas to betray Jesus. And right at the end of this conversation, this little boy says to me, Miss Glover, I think every single person needs to know what it means to betray someone and to be betrayed. Therefore, they betray people and people betray us. And that's a fact. That's how it is. And it's just really interesting, isn't it, what you do with that? How do you handle that sense of, it might be rejection, it might be being left out, it might be excluded, whatever it might mean to you. Betrayal's a big thing. And Jesus is very troubled in his spirit, according to John. But what do the disciples do? After they've nudged one another and go, is it you, is it you, is it you? Their argument goes deeper, doesn't it? It accelerates. It reminds me of children arguing over stuff. It wasn't me, miss, it was him. Was it you? Was it me? But then they had a dispute, and their dispute was about being the greatest. Who's considered to be the greatest? Who's the best? Who's the person that I think is wonderful, and I don't like them, or I don't like them? And anyway, I'm the greatest anyway. Can you imagine it, can't you? All these disciples having a bit of an argument at the table. So what does Jesus say to them? The kings of the Gentiles domineer over you, and those who have authority are called benefactors. And again, this goes back to a Middle Eastern thing. Basically, what they used to do was have processions, and their benefactors, their I guess money people, would follow them and parade and process. And it was a big deal. And Jesus says, don't process before men your reputation. No, you are to be different, not people pleasers. You are the ones who stood by me in my trials. And so, just as my Father granted you a kingdom, I, and literal word is, I covenant to you that you will eat at my table in my kingdom and sit on the throne judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Basically, Jesus is saying to us, I covenant to you. I give myself away to you, and one day you will eat with me in the kingdom. And then he says to Peter, even you, my closest friend, you're going to let me down. You are going to deny me even this very night 3 times. I wonder how Jesus feels saying that to his beloved disciples that he's walked with for 3 years. I think in telling them, he also gives them another opportunity to not let him down. And he promises, even though they do this, he will give them authority. Even as he faces death, Jesus is saying to them, I'm preparing you for what's to come. What a meal. Humility, dependence, authority, reward, warning about opposition. He says, if you follow me, you're going to have opposition, and faithfulness. Those are the topics of this meal. And the Luke passage concludes with Jesus taking a robe, a belt, ready for what's to come, and saying, up until now, things have been okay. But there's a dramatic change coming, and you need to know and get ready for the opposition. Those that were hospitable to you before will not be in the future. There's a time to go with nothing and a time to be prepared for everything. But, he says, you are not to withdraw or be afraid. So, he's given us that opportunity, that enabling to face whatever's to come for us. And I couldn't have planned those stories this morning, but they were all about suffering, weren't they? They're all about what's happened or what is happening. And, you know, Jesus in 1 Peter 1 says, Peter says about Jesus, it's indicated by his faithfulness that we get to stand. When we were in South Korea in November, Andy and I, we met a young man who was 22. And some of you have heard this story if you came to our evening. But he was amazing. He was a swimmer. And he was a North Korean lad who, at 18, because they get enforced military service at 18 for 10 years, His mum said, you need to get out. You've got to leave. And they found it very difficult because there's lots of problems. But this young man said, I'm going to swim for it. He decided he was going to get over the electric fence somehow in North Korea and get into the sea, the border that goes between North and South, and swim 22 kilometers. 22 kilometers this young man swam. And as he was swimming, he says he prayed that when he got to the other side, the electric fence would be off so he could get over into South Korea and escape. And sure enough, it was. And we got to meet him. We got to hear his story. And you know, he gave everything to get out. He could have died, he could have been shot, he could have been electrocuted to escape with Jesus from what was opposing him, what was weighing him down. He sought freedom. So the meal concludes, and where does this story lead? It leads to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. And at the Garden of Gethsemane, it's about 1.5 miles downhill and uphill from the garden. It looks like this. It's not as big as it once was because it's 2,000 years ago, but it's still there. And Jesus, you can just imagine him, can't you, walking with the disciples. I wonder what they talked about. I love it in John's Gospel. There are 3 chapters, 14, 15, 16, 4 chapters, and 17, that are between the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane. And he talks some of his famous passages there. I only do what my Father says I should. And I pray for you as my disciples that you may be one. That covenant identity again. One. So that the world may know that I and the Father are one and I've been sent. And so we come to this garden and Jesus says to his disciples, just stay here. And then he goes forward to pray and he becomes to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch. And when he rose from prayer, goes back to his disciples and finds them asleep. Why are you sleeping, he says. Get up and pray, so you will not fall into temptation. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they found an ancient olive press. And it's quite apt that Jesus goes to this garden where they press olives. And he feels this sense of crushing, this sense of trying to win over in his flesh. And then he surrenders and said, not yet my will, but yours be done. In Matthew's Gospel, he goes back to his disciples and he says the words, can you not watch with me for 1 hour? Can you not watch with me for 1 hour? So I'm going to leave you with that challenge. Can you not watch this week, this Holy Week 2022 with Jesus for at least 1 hour?